was strongly committed, or at least committed, I would not say believed strongly. President Lincoln always had a record of believing that colonization was a good thing. I commend to you probably one of his most powerful speeches. His most powerful speech, probably, at least in my view, was something called the Cooper Union speech. In 1859, Abraham Lincoln had become a famous man. He had become a famous man because here in Illinois, in 1858, he ran for the United States Senate against Stephen A. Douglas. And that campaign made him known via newspapers and across the country. He then got invited to tour the country and make other speeches. Exactly as happened in 2013 when candidates become famous. Illinois state senators, get invited to do other things when they, and so on. And he went and gave the Cooper Union speech. May I commend you? You may not have time for this kind of reading. What the kind of work you're doing requires too much attention to other kinds of reading. But I commend to you the Cooper Union speech, because the Cooper Union speech is a very careful analysis of what Abraham Lincoln in 1859 said that the original framers of the Constitution had done. He counted how many of them there were, how many of them, when the 1787 convention began, there were 55. When it ended, there were 39. So that the others went home, one or two may have died, and so on. I've forgotten, frankly, whether somebody expired during the course of the, but it wouldn't be surprised. You get 55 people, they meet someplace in May. Between May and September, not all survive. They don't all agree that they fight and so on. That is the normal way. Lincoln walked through that from the 55 to the 39 with who voted for what. And what was he struggling with? He was struggling over the slavery question. He was struggling over what the Constitution said and meant about slavery. Now again, since you're all librarians, I assume complete and perfect knowledge of everything. And I assume, since you're not librarians, but I see a variety of smartphones in hands on in front of me, I assume people are checking already everything that I may have said that may be wrong. So I speak with some care, but after 1857, the Dred Scott case, the question of what the Constitution did and did not provide or did or did not allow was a hot political question. And Lincoln had moved to the far edge of what it permitted and did not permit. Listen to me very carefully, because there is some language that must be taken into account. At that time, as of 1859, the Lincoln position was, nope, what's 1859? That's 1 year before 1860. The election year, the year South Carolina seceded. In 1859, it's also the John Brown year, by the way. In 1859, Lincoln's position was that the Constitution provided that slavery would be protected where it was. Where it was. And it would be put, quote, in the course of ultimate extinction. Protected where it was, but presumably would die out. Now, by the way, that's not Lincoln's language. That came out somebody's speech in New Hampshire in 1788, when New Hampshire was debating whether to ratify the Constitution, in the course of ultimate extinction. Now, may I for a moment say that from 1788 up to 1859, things had gone. One, there was a brief period in which all people thought that slavery would die. Then suddenly, it swung the other way. You're here in a conference in which you're working on questions of technology. Never forget the importance of technology in promoting the growth of slavery. Why? The cotton gin. Now, most people here, I know, don't know anything about cotton in the field. If you're lucky, you don't, because cotton is very, I've been in cotton fields, and you know, talk about, you can't see, holding my fingers 2.5 inches apart, something like that, the size of a line. A cotton boll looks kind of like a line. And when it matures, it is hard and brown and pops open, and the cotton is taken out. And the cotton seeds have high economic value, and the fiber has high economic value. And it is nothing but a luxury unless you can have a great quantity of it. The cotton gin, a machine for extracting the seed from the fiber, made cotton into a product so that it became enormously valuable all of a sudden. In about 10, again, elsewhere I've done some charts on the growth of cotton acreage. And the growth of cotton acreage goes up like that, post-gin. And with cotton acreage goes the demand for cotton labor. And cotton labor meant, in the United States, African slave labor. Now, put in a footnote. I'm not going to talk about it now. No one went out looking for African slave labor because someone had some notion that that was the population best available to do work. No, it was, that gets into the whole history of slavery, which is not what I'm here about tonight. It was because the most available labor was, the nearest available labor was the West African coast. And the slave trade grew enormously, slavery grew enormously, its economic value in the United States grew enormously, and its political defenses went up sharply. And so you had a period of 20 or 30 years of severe battling over that. But to step back, the problem of protecting slavery where it was ceased to be a politically acceptable issue. And by 1859, the country was severely divided. It may or may not have been a moral question. When we move up to 1859, on the cut, I commend to you the less attractive Gettysburg Address. Back here on the wall is a reference to the 272 words. But at the same time, for 2.5 hours, which is not as long as I'm going to talk, for 2.5 hours, Edward Everett had delivered an address at the Gettysburg dedication, in which Edward Everett analyzed in detail his view of why the Civil War had occurred. And to him, the Civil War had occurred by virtue of the demands of the cotton-growing states. I think he was basically right. And something else. They thought they would win. Now, those of you who think about politics and the decisions people make should think some as well about how and why people make really bad decisions. Decisions they think they're going to win, where in losing they face considerable destruction. I will say nothing about debt ceilings and other such things. On that subject, I will pass on. But the demand was that the country should be open to the expansion of slavery wherever slave investors chose. Now, many of you have been taught that, well, slave labor couldn't work outside the places where it was. That's nonsense. If serfdom worked in Russia, why would not slave labor work in the United States, where a climate less severe than that in Russia? If it worked in the rest of the world, as it did, the United States was not the only place. Why would it not? And people who sought to make their fortunes in that way had a demand that the country be open. Did that produce a moral issue? Yes, for many. But there's something else. That something else was that if my ancestors were here in one form, the ancestors of many who were before me at this moment were here in another way, who came because the country was beginning to fill up with immigrants from Europe. Until then, the movement, the country had been filling up with imported slave labor. And you come, all the people coming in from Europe, who also have to go somewhere. And where is the somewhere? From Ohio westward, across Indiana, across Illinois, across Iowa, and so you have a struggle over the land area that remains. And you come to 1860, and an election in which there is a severe split. And the split is so severe that you get the result with which we today live. No, I emphasize this by saying something else. Anybody ever ask yourself, what would happen if Abraham Lincoln had been elected in 1860 and the constituent states had not seceded? If you've never asked that question yourself, stop for a moment and think about it. They would have held all of the congressional seats that they gave up, all of the senatorial seats that they gave up, and therefore not a single federal marshal appointed by the president could have been confirmed. Not a single postmaster could have been confirmed. Not a single federal judge could have been confirmed. That is, if a party that loses a presidential election has a strong place in the House and a strong place in the Senate, then the president is nearly staggered unless he can discover other means of acting. No, they chose to bet that there was another way of doing it. And we do not know exactly what that bet was, but from this came what the president described as this terrible war. Now, this terrible war produced, as a military matter, the Emancipation Proclamation. It also produced some version of history that you have all learned in a cinematic form. That is, I may protest, the history teachers here may protest. We all have to accept the fact that hereafter, the history that is taught is going to be history a la Lincoln. Lincoln, the movie. The movie will always triumph over anything that is more valid. We just have to accept that. And we will spend time writing articles of correction and limitation, and so be it. But what is the movie about? The Spielberg movie is at least about the 13th Amendment. It is the 13th Amendment that prescribes slavery forever in the United States. Now, let me switch and come to the third piece. The third piece is that after 1865, the country goes into a struggle. David Blight has a book called Race and Reunion. I read a piece of it the other night in which someone talked about the surrender of Appomattox and the marvels of Robert E. Lee, and said that Robert E. Lee was a great man who saved the country from a protracted stint of guerrilla war. Nonsense. That's a harsh statement on my part. Why do I choose the harsh statement? Because what I'm referring to is the former Confederate South after the 1860s. And when I say the former Confederate South after the 1860s, my wife looked at me and saying, "What time is it?" I've got her watch, so I know. After the 1860s, the Confederate Army in civilian dress ruled the former Confederate South. The guerrilla warfare, therefore, was a warfare in which the former slave population learned what people do learn, that it is better to stay outside the realm of Winchester rifle politics. Perhaps the Winchester rifle is an old-fashioned way of describing it. The Winchester rifle was then a powerful form of weaponry. These days, anyone knows the much more powerful forms of weaponry available to individual persons. But the name of the game is that when faced with a gun, debate always subsides. The only way that debate does not subside is when it is gun against gun. That was not the experience. Let me illustrate what I mean to get to this. Joe Natale, in introducing me, referred to the Mississippi Constitutional Convention of 1890. May I offer you some arithmetic? In 1890, Mississippi had a constitutional convention to rewrite the state constitution. In 1890, the electorate was male, was men. The women's suffrage question had not quite gotten there. Reserving that issue, in 1890, the Mississippi electorate was, legally speaking, 60% black. I repeat, because I've given you a number that I'm quite sure that you have not encountered, except in very unusual circumstances. In 1890, the Mississippi electorate was 60% black, legally. In 1890, Mississippi elected a constitutional convention. 134 men were elected. 1890, the black proportion of that convention was 1 in 134. That is to say, Joe referred to my work on Isaiah Montgomery. I won't go into anything about Montgomery, but except he was elected. All the rest were white. Why? Because Winchester white Republicans controlled the day. My way of saying this is there were three big presidential problems in the time of Lincoln. One was the maintenance of the Union. That one, Lincoln won. Two, the termination of chattel slavery. Chattel slavery, if you've not thought about chattel slavery, think hard. Everybody in this room, sometime yesterday or today, said, or if not today, tomorrow, said or will say, I want something new that I don't have. It may be a box of writing paper, or a piece of clothing, or some food, or a piece of equipment. So I'm going to go down to the store and buy some. Chattel slavery meant that everybody said, who had the money, say, oh, I want some more work that I have absolute control over. I'm going to go down to the market and buy me a new houseboy, or a bunch of new houseboys, or whatever. That is the meaning of chattel slavery. Chattel slavery disappeared. The third item is, what do you do with a free population? How does it integrate into the political system? How does it integrate into the economy? That was the harder problem. Basically, what happened was that something approximating some version of intense subordination restored itself around about 1900. So that the world that you have read about and that some of us lived in from 1900 down to the 1960s came into being. In other words, one part of the Lincoln legacy, one part of the Lincoln decisions simply failed, did not work. And that is a tough thing to think about. It's a tough thing to think about, not only with regard to the United States as it is, but as to what human beings do, how they work, how they live, how things change and do not change. It is not that the world in the United States is precisely like that now. Just 2 days ago, I was running the weapons symposium at the University of Illinois, Springfield, and my colleague Wilbur Rich came and delivered a lecture based in large part upon his book. It's called The Post-Racial Societies Here. And he encountered resistance from those who took umbrage at the implications of his very title. But that is another matter. In thinking about the Lincoln phenomenon, I put these things to you as ways to begin to open some discussion that with your particular talents and competences, you may help your users, your friends, your families, people like me, first of all, think about what the world may yet become. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Holden. Andrew has the microphone if there was any questions.
Or comments, or objections. No shoes? Way in the back, thank you.
I'm just curious as to what part of Mississippi you were born and raised in.
Say again.
What part of Mississippi were you born and raised?
I was born in a town called Mound Bayou in Bolivar County, which is about 100 miles south of Memphis. I saw somebody react as if she knew about Mound Bayou.
Is that near Glendora?
I'm sorry?
Is that near Glendora?
I just don't know. Mississippi is a state of small towns. There are a lot of them. Do you have any idea where Glendora is? I know where Tallahassee County is. Tallahassee County is 60 miles more or less east. The town in which I was born is about 10 or 15 miles near the Mississippi River. I saw a hand somewhere way in the back. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, please.
That's okay, if there's a different one. If Lincoln had not been assassinated, would our history be radically different? Our present be radically different?
That is a crucial question. If Lincoln had not been assassinated, would our present be radically different? I'll crawfish on that a little bit. You have to just choose whether or not the person has enough control over the available resources in a combat situation, a political combat situation, to make that much difference. My guess is perhaps not. Let me be a little specific. President Lincoln's approach to the problem as he faced was very specific. The question arose, what should be done in Louisiana, which the Union Army had conquered? And he said his habit of dealing with political situations was to send communications saying, I very much suggest. He very seldom gave direct orders. But people who worked with him had a pretty good idea what he wanted. If they were disposed to agree, then they agreed. And so there was somebody in Louisiana whom he suggested handle the making of a new constitution, bless you, handle making it in a particular way. And the question he had to answer was, who should be permitted to vote? His answer was, I suggest that some of the blacks be permitted to vote, particularly something like, the educated, that's not quite the right language, and those who have fought with us. So that would have meant black veterans. The question is, all right, would that have made sufficient difference to stabilize Louisiana the way he wanted it stabilized? Maybe it would have, maybe it wouldn't have. the resistance otherwise was so strong that you have to be uncertain. That's my crawfishy answer.
Thank you.
Okay. Wish I had a better. Someone had a hand up.
I have my